Welcome, and today we are going to be discussing principles of man. The principle we're looking at today is courage. Courage is your ability to not show fear in the presence of danger, really and truly. Now, why do men need to be able to do this? Well, quite simply put, as a man, you have responsibilities. You have responsibilities to protect, you have responsibility to keep your word, you have responsibility to be honest. Now, those are all good things. But the problem is, in a world that has corruption, in a world where you can be bribed to lie, in a world where you can be led to cheat, not just in the sense of cheating your wife, but to cheat somebody and to be dishonest, going through something like what Zacchaeus went through. It takes courage to do the right thing. I'm not talking about the foolish things or doing something stupid just for the sake of a thrill. That's not necessarily courage. You may be bold or brash when doing something like that, but that's not the same as courage. No, courage is being strong when it counts. I had a discussion with a friend recently, and they were asking me, why am I so relentless about doing the right thing, or why do I refuse to give up when things become more difficult? And the thing is this, if I say I'm going to do something, I need to do it. It's nobody else's responsibility to make me do something. Now, if you have a mentor, you have a father, you have a close friend, they are going to encourage you to do those things that are hard, especially when you said you're going to do them. You have to have your mind made up, and you have to decide, I'm not going to turn back. I'm going to keep going forward, even though this thing is difficult, even though quitting would be easy, even though it would be much more comfortable to myself, even though it would be easy because nobody is going to hold me accountable. And that's a trap that a lot of people, not just men, fall into. Is that without any accountability, they don't feel the responsibility to live up to expectations, even that we set for ourselves. So when you have courage and you actually act on it, you're going to hold yourself accountable to your word. You're going to hold yourself accountable to those you've made promises to. And then when something difficult is placed in front of you, you're going to keep going. Now, as a man, I know we like talking about fighters on this channel, so I'll use a fighter as an example. John Ryder fought Canelo Alvarez recently, and he wound up losing the fight. But the thing is, I believe it was the 5th round or the 6th round, Canelo Alvarez hit John Ryder with a very, very hard shot to his body. And anybody who knows fighting knows that Canelo Alvarez is definitely a hard puncher. You could easily qualify him as a bricklayer. Now, Ryder, you could see the look on his face when he was struggling to get back to his feet. He could have just stayed down because he wound up losing the fight anyway. So to somebody else, they would say, well, why not just stay down? Give up. You lost anyway. What was the point of giving up? Well, the point is he didn't do his absolute best. He was able to come back and rally in that 12th round and still put up a decent fight. He was still able to press hard. That's an example of doing your absolute best. It takes courage to do that when there's pain in front of you and you're saying, I'm going to walk through this pain. I'm going to face this pain, even though it's easier to ignore it. That's an example of courage. Now, for a sport, it may not be as important. Another example, though, that I could think of would be David when he faced Goliath. There were a lot of other instances in David's life when he showed courage to do the right thing. But the most famous would be when he faces Goliath. People who don't read the Bible know that story. We're going to talk more about David in the future, by the way, because there are a lot of examples in David's life that can apply to our lives today. And we should learn from the examples of the past. We should learn what to do, and we should learn what not to do. But the enemy was at the gates. That's why Goliath was there. And he's calling out the men of Israel. He's basically saying, where are the men? And he's calling out the God of Israel. He's saying, where is your God? Now, as representatives of God Almighty, you should not be afraid of Satan and his followers. That was the message David was sending. And David even asks the people present, is there not a cause? In other words, why are we here? Are we fighting for the sake of fighting? No. With the example I used previously, between the two boxers, you could argue, well, they're just fighting for the sake of fighting. And you'd be correct. But in the case of David versus Goliath, that's not what's going on. This man has come here, he's defied your God, he's defied your people, he's defied your men. He has dared you to stop him from doing what he knows is wrong. He's given you a challenge show me what you're really made of. That's the proposition he's putting forth to an entire nation. And only one man out of that whole nation, who was a boy at the time, was willing to step forward, step up against the opposition, and prove what real courage is. And that's a perfect example of courage because it's dangerous. It's a fight to the death. This man is, bigger than everybody else. He's got armor on. He's been fighting since he was a little boy. He's killed men before. He's done this before. He's been prepared for battle. But what a lot of people overlooked was, so was David. David, we're going to go more into him later on, I said before, but David, he's the son who isn't sitting next to the father. He's the son who's outside guarding the sheepfold. He's the one who's been camping out with the lions, camping with the bears, protecting the flock from the wolves. So he's already been prepped by his livelihood to be a protector. So when danger rose against him, that's exactly what he said. He said, when I destroy this Philistine, he'll be just as one of the bear or a wolf or a lion that came against the flock. And that's what he's telling you. He's like, there's an enemy at the gates who's here to kill and to steal and to destroy. So you need to be able to protect, to preserve, and to hold. Hold against stealing, protect against killing, preserve things from being destroyed. That's your responsibility to yourself first. Then, as a man, as a husband, as a father, it's your responsibility to your wife, and it's responsibility to your children. So the older you get, the greater your responsibilities become. They don't become less and less as time goes on. They become greater and greater. And in your youth, you should take advantage of youth and prepare yourself for those things that are there to come. Now, I understand in today's world, not everybody has a good father who's being the role model that they need. And that's very sad, but if you're in a church, if you're a pastor, then that is a place that you can fill up for that person. You can start first by being a good example. Be a good example of courage. When David did what he did, he was an example for an entire nation of men to do what needs to be done when there's real danger present. He did not surrender to Goliath. He did not parley with Goliath to try to find peace because he understood Goliath was not there for that. Any type of agreement he came to with the enemy would have been to David's disadvantage and would have been to Goliath's advantage. So instead, he showed courage, and he showed it when it counted the most, because the enemy was there to destroy. Now, how can we apply this to our life today? Well, as men, I'm talking to the Christian men out there right now, God gave you a responsibility. We gave it to Adam. He said, you'll work by the sweat of your brow. You provide for your wife, you provide for your children, you protect them. You teach the boys to be men, and the older men teach the young men to be good older men. So you have a responsibility to be an example to them. You can teach them verbally, you can teach them physically, but I personally believe the best way to show someone is to lead by example. And I use the word principle when I'm describing courage because a principle is a standard, especially for good behavior. That's one of the ways it's defined, a rule. So it's something that doesn't change over time. When you have standards, the standard of yesterday doesn't change tomorrow, doesn't change in the future. So the reason why you have to hold true to that is because if you change the standard, you're going to change the outcome. For example, a foot has 12 inches inside of it. If somebody was working on a building and they said, well, I'm going to make my foot have 10 inches in it, but everybody else kept the same standard, then that person would be the odd one out. You'd be able to see, well, this person is making a mistake. And so that applies to men as well. If one man is willing to do what he's supposed to do, he fulfills all his responsibilities. But then you have a group of men next to him who refuse to fulfill their responsibilities. He's going to stick out from the rest. And that's exactly what happened with David. 3 of his elder brothers, they're supposed to be protecting him. They're supposed to be leading him by example. So what happens is when you have men who do not fulfill their responsibilities, the younger generation is going to have to step up and take on more work because they have to do what the leaders are supposed to be doing. They have to rise up and become the leader often in a lot of cases. Even with Moses, a lot of people don't think about that. Moses was the youngest of his brother and sister. But again, he had to be the leader. Joseph, second to the youngest, he had to be the leader among them because he was the one who was being responsible. He was the one who held true to his convictions and his principles. So courage is something that you have to hold on to because especially, it's always been the case. You know, a lot of times we say especially in today's age, but that's always been the case that you have to hold true to your convictions. You know, when people despise you for being honest, when people don't appreciate you being truthful, when people don't appreciate honesty, when they don't appreciate courage. You know, a lot of people are not grateful to someone behaving courageously. They tell people, well, no, as a man, as a godly man, you should not be strong. You shouldn't be courageous. You should be submissive and subjective and obedient. And you should let somebody else lead you. And that's not what God has called men to be. Now, it's true that we often had leaders in times. You know, David became king of his nation. Samson led his nation for a while, even though in the end he did not do a very good job of it. Joshua was a leader. Moses was a leader. So, the thing is, though, with those leaders, each of those men, they were selected by God. You know, God picked them for the job because he knew they were fit to do it. And often, he picked those men because the nation as a whole was not fulfilling its responsibility. So, when everyone else behaves inadequately, then yes, there is going to be a time when a leader has to rise up and lead by example and show people how it's done. But, as a good leader, you do not desire to be the only courageous one. You teach others how to walk in their courage. You teach others how to walk in your strength. You teach others how to be a man of principles. First of all, that makes your work a whole lot easier. If you read Numbers, you'll see that's the same thing that Moses did. When Moses was the leader, he was taking on the responsibility of everybody else in the tribe, all the men, all the problems they had with their wives, all the problems they had with their children, all the problems they had with themselves and one another. He became exhausted. So that's when the priests showed up, the Levites. He began to delegate, and they begin to judge certain matters. They begin to handle things as well. So what he's doing is he's building up. At first we had one leader. Now we had several people who were able to teach. They would still answer to Moses as the ultimate leader, but Moses would answer to God. And that was the choice the people made, because in the beginning, God chose to speak directly to the people, but they didn't want him to. They preferred Moses to be the mediator between the two of them. And that may seem off topic, but it's still the same principle. Moses had the courage to do what God called him to do when it was difficult. David had the courage to face the giant, to face the lion, to face the bear, to face the wolves when they were attacking the sheep. But also, those men also understood that you had to train the next generation to be leaders. And when we do that, that makes our job a whole lot easier. If you have one man, and he is a courageous man, he holds his principles, and there are 4 men younger than him, and they see him as an example of what they should be doing. And even you could be a person on the sideline saying, yeah, that's the kind of man you should be behaving like. When we do that, we as men, we're going to work to become that kind of man. We're going to work to be courageous. We're going to work to have principles. And those are the kind of things we need to encourage among one another. So a principle, one of the basic standards for men, a rule that every man needs to hold up, is to be courageous. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys in the future.